Hey there everybody, in this video we're going to get a little bit nerdy and talk about how different handlebars and stem lengths affect the handling of a bike. Let's say you're riding a swept bar bike like this. How would it feel like if you swapped it to a drop bar handlebar? Or vice versa. Let's say you currently have a bike with drop bars. How would the steering and handling change if you changed it to something like this swept back handlebar? It's a little bit of a complicated topic. I'm going to try to explain it as simply as possible and just give you some basic tools so you can kind of figure out how your bike's handling will change as you change handlebars. So the first thing we have to talk about is this idea of trail. In most simple terms, trail is a number that you see on some geometry charts, and it's a function of the head tube angle, the fork offset, and the tire size. And the lower the trail number, the more nimble and responsive the bike is, and the higher the trail number, the more stable the bike is. So typically mountain bikes have trail numbers in the 90s to the 100s. A low trail bike is a bike that has trail in the upper 20s to mid 30s. Mid trail, we're talking road bikes here, are usually in the upper 50s to the low to mid 60s. So one thing that's interesting about a trail number is that to some extent it's baked into a bike. So for example, the trail on this Rivendell is calculated to about 62 or 63. Typical of what you'd find in a road bike / endurance road bike. And that is a baked in trail because it's determined by lots of things that don't change, like head tube angle, fork offset, tire size, all that stuff. However, I do want to introduce another concept, and that is perceived trail. And that is how the trail changes as you change your position on the front of the bike. And this concept really came to me as I was riding this Rivendell, because I've ridden many bikes with a 63 baked in trail number, but for some reason this bike felt a lot more responsive. When I was steering from the rear end of the handlebars, the bike felt a lot more responsive when compared to other bikes that I've ridden with a 62 millimeter trail. Conversely, when riding the Riv closer to the front of the handlebars in a similar position where the hoods of a drop bar would be, the bike felt a little bit more stable and was a little bit closer to what I remembered a bike with a 62, 63 millimeter trail to be. So for me, this was a bit of an aha moment, because there is the baked in trail, the trail that is set by kind of just the geometry of the bike, but then there is also how we perceive that trail, and that's a little bit more dynamic and changes depending on your handlebar. So what does that mean to you? Basically, you can kind of predict how a bike will handle by looking at a geometry chart, but that's not the end of the story, and it's going to be greatly influenced by your riding position on the front end of the bike and the handlebar you choose. Okay, so here are some big, broad, kind of basic ways a bike's handling will change depending on how you change certain components. All things being equal, if you are going from a drop bar bike to something with swept back bars, the further the bars sweep back, the more responsive the steering is going to be. You're a little bit more upright, there's less weight over the front wheel, and most of the handlebars are going to be a little bit wider, so that's going to give you more leverage with the steering input, requiring less force to steer the bike. So the wider and further back you go, the lighter the steering will be. That's why if you think about mountain bikes, they have really high trail but can still feel somewhat more responsive and nimble than the trail number would suggest. And that's because they're running shorter stems with wide controls. So right now this Riv is set up with swept back bars that puts me at a really upright position. So pretty quick to handle actually. Let's say if I swap these out to a drop bar handlebar, this would put my weight a little bit further forward and in turn slow the steering response down. It would feel a little bit more stable overall when compared to how it is currently set up. Let's say you've got a drop bar bike now and you want to experiment with some wider drop bars. How would that affect your steering? The wider a handlebar gets, all things being equal, once again, the more stable it's going to feel. The narrower the bar gets, the more nimble and responsive it's going to feel. Another thing you could change is stem length. And typically from what I've found, the longer the stem length, the more that puts you in front of the steering axis here. That's going to act to kind of chill out the steering and make it more stable feeling. Conversely, as you shorten the stem, it's going to put you closer to the steering axis, more rearward, and that will quicken the steering. So again, I'm not an engineer, so I can't give you specific maths, but it is something you can fine tune. So let's say you go to a wider gravel bar, but you don't want to lose that responsive steering. You could also shorten the stem. That would actually adjust for the reach increase with the wider bar, and that might balance out to have a net zero effect. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. The big major concepts I want you to walk away with is, yes, there is a trail number that you can calculate that some geometry charts will show, but that trail number isn't the end of the story, and that there is something else that I am calling perceived trail, which changes depending on your handlebar setup and your positioning relative to the front of the bike. Again, generally speaking, if you are going from drop bars to something with more sweep, if it has an extreme sweep and starts to put most of your weight behind the head tube, that will quicken the steering of the bike. Conversely, if you're going from a swept bar bike to something with drop bars and that puts more of your weight in front of the head tube, that will act to chill out the steering and make it more stable. So hopefully that was helpful, not too confusing. If you guys have any questions, leave those in the comments below. And as always, keep the supple side down.